Have you ever wondered what the ancients truly feared when the sun slipped below the horizon? Long before modern ghost tales or haunted house legends, the Greeks and Romans walked through a world where the boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall, but a trembling veil. In their stories, the dead did not simply rest. They lingered. They wandered. They returned. Imagine a ghost chained to its unburied bones, rattling through an abandoned courtyard. A warrior appearing on a battlefield centuries after his fall. A lover rising from the grave for 3 fleeting nights of passion. Or a philosopher calmly waiting as a specter draped in iron shackles steps out of the dark. Tonight, we open the ancient gates of the underworld and follow Lacey Collison Morley's forgotten accounts of Greek and Roman ghost stories tales, where every shadow hides a question, and every whisper might belong to the dead. From the earliest ages of Greek and Roman civilization, one idea remained unshakably rooted in the minds of the ancient world. Death was never an absolute ending. The ancients believed that life continued beyond the grave, though their understanding of that continued existence was often clouded by contradictions, uncertainties, and overlapping traditions. Yet this ambiguity only seemed to deepen their fascination with the dead, allowing ghostly presences to occupy an essential place in their culture, hovering between fear, reverence, and a primal longing to understand what lies beyond. Classical literature offers vivid glimpses into this confusion. In the 6th book of the Aeneid, Virgil portrays the afterlife as a structured realm where souls are judged, rewarded, or punished. But this grand, mythic vision coexisted with a far older belief, one deeply embedded in both Greek and Italian ritual, that the spirit lingered close to its body. To the early Romans, the tomb was not merely a monument. It was a dwelling, a small home prepared for the dead, who continued to exist in a shadowy but recognizable form. Offerings of food, wine, and flowers were not symbolic gestures, but sustenance, given because the dead, though transformed, still needed nourishment. As cremation became more common and bodies no longer rested intact within the tomb, the concept of an independent soul gained strength. People began to imagine the spirit descending to a vast cavern in the depths of the earth, a place where countless others dwelled for eternity. This gradually became the official theoretical model of the afterlife in Rome, though the older folk beliefs never disappeared. The dead lived below, but they also lived within their graves. They were far away, yet also alarmingly close. The Etruscan imagination added another layer of darkness. Their art and ritual introduced the figure of the conductor of the dead, a terrifying daemon with tangled hair, wings, and a heavy hammer, an image so striking that later generations believed Dante's vision of the Inferno may have drawn inspiration from these ancient Tuscan terrors. To the Etruscans, death was not simply a transition. It was a realm governed by grim forces, ready to drag the departing soul into its rightful place. Roman sources confirm how naturally the idea of the dead returning to the earth fitted into this worldview. Cicero tells us that every Latin city had its mundus, a deep ritual pit considered an entrance to the underworld. This pit was sealed most of the year, but on 3 appointed days, August 25, October 5, and November 8, the stone that covered it, the lapis manalis, was removed. On these days, the dead were believed to ascend freely into the world of the living, moving among their descendants and receiving offerings laid out to appease them. Far from being considered unnatural, the return of the dead was built into the calendar, recognized as part of the proper functioning of the universe. While alive, a Roman's relationship with the dead was regulated with careful respect. The spirits were not abstract metaphors. They were considered minor gods, with altars of their own. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, famously told her sons that they would someday honor her as a divine ancestor. The cult of the Lares, the household guardians, symbolized the idea that family spirits remained near the hearth, watching over daily life. Indeed, it was difficult to distinguish between the Lares and the Mans, the spirits of ordinary good people who had passed on. To the ancients, the dead were not gone. They were transformed into protectors, witnesses, and occasional wanderers. Festivals for the dead reappeared each year. In Rome, the Dies Parentalos stretched from February 13th to the 21st, a somber season when families tended graves and performed rites of remembrance. In Greece, the Genesia served a similar purpose. Though its exact rituals remain obscure, the emotional core of these observances reveals something profoundly human: the pagan hunger for continuity. As Cicero himself argued, a man's desire to be remembered after death was not vanity but evidence of an instinctive belief in immortality. Some wealthy Romans left funds to ensure their memory would be preserved through annual feasts at their tombs. Yet others, like the satirist Lucian, mocked these customs, imagining starving shades relying on the devotion or neglect of their surviving relatives. Tombs built along the roads into Rome were more than memorials. They were situated deliberately so the dead might take comfort from the greetings of travelers passing by. These architectural choices reflect a poignant truth. The ancients feared oblivion almost as much as death itself. Writers like Giosuè Carducci capture the raw emotional landscape behind these beliefs. Carducci recalls sitting in a classroom on a bright June day, captivated by the sunlight on cherry trees and distant hills. Overwhelmed suddenly by the thought of his own mortality, he envisioned his lifeless body buried beneath dark soil, while the world above continued its joyful dance. This experience, which haunted him for years, echoes the feelings of countless Greeks and Romans whose love of life intensified their dread of leaving it behind. For them, the promise of peace, pax tecum aeterna, was the greatest gift death could offer. The shadowy realm beyond was a pale imitation of earthly life. Even Achilles, speaking to Odysseus in the underworld, confessed he would rather live as a poor man's servant than reign as a king among the dead. When ghosts appeared in dreams or visions, they were typically faint replicas of their former selves, pale, weightless, often still dressed as they had been in life. Patroclus visiting Achilles, Hadrian reflecting upon his own departing soul in the famous Animula Vagula Blandula, and countless anonymous shades all reinforce one idea: the soul retains its identity even after it has loosened the bonds of flesh, returning to earth as an ethereal echo. Yet there was one class of spirits the ancients truly feared: the unburied dead, denied the rites necessary to cross into Hades. These souls wandered restlessly for 100 years. They clung to the places where their bodies lay, seeking help, vengeance, or merely release. Their presence was considered dangerous, not because they were evil by nature, but because they were caught between worlds. The Greeks and Romans thus lived in a universe where death was porous, where souls moved across boundaries according to laws both sacred and fragile. Whether honored, feared, or pitied, the dead were always near. Their return was not a miracle or horror, but an accepted truth, a power woven into the very fabric of ancient life. Among the civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean, the Greeks and Romans often appear to us as models of reason, practicality, and intellectual discipline. Their systems of law, philosophy, and government have shaped centuries of thought. Yet beneath this surface of rationality, both cultures nurtured a persistent belief in ghosts, shades of the departed who could, under certain conditions, intrude upon the world of the living. Their ghost stories may appear sparse in literature, but this scarcity reflects not disbelief, but rather a cultural restraint. Ghosts were feared, respected, and woven silently into the moral and ritual fabric of daily life. For the Romans, especially, religion was an intricate system of duties, conducted with precise formulas and rituals. Their piety was not rooted in mystical ecstasy, but in fulfilling obligations that kept harmony between the human and divine worlds. The dead were no exception. Romans felt that as long as they dutifully maintained the rites owed to their ancestors, those spirits would remain quiet and benevolent. But even within that order, people longed to be free of old burdens, including the cost and responsibilities of tomb maintenance. Creative lawyers soon devised symbolic sales of these obligations, allowing families to escape them without dishonor, a legal sleight of hand that hints at how seriously Roman society took its duties toward the dead. The Greeks, by contrast, filled their imagination with myths and heroic tales. Their gods and spirits appeared in every grove, river, and mountain. Yet, in their classical age, an era of philosophers and dramatists, they displayed a remarkable sobriety toward the supernatural. Their ghost lore rarely descended into fantasy. Instead, it reflected a seasoned understanding of the fragility of life, the weight of unfulfilled duties, and the fear of what lingered after death. Nevertheless, with the arrival of Eastern mystery cults religions steeped in ecstatic rites, trance, and visions, the Greco-Roman world experienced a surge of interest in apparitions, omens, and otherworldly visitors. Even the educated were not immune to belief. Pliny the Younger, one of Rome's most refined thinkers, openly questioned whether ghosts possessed form, substance, or divine origin. His famous letter about the haunted house in Athens shows his willingness to consider the possibility that certain phenomena could not be dismissed. The image of a chained ghost, rattling through an abandoned property until its buried remains were uncovered, became a template for countless later haunted house stories. Pliny's curiosity was balanced by the extraordinary credulity of his friend Suetonius, a biographer whose sensitivity to dreams bordered on superstition. When Suetonius wrote to him in fear, begging to postpone a legal case because of a troubling dream, Pliny not only agreed, but treated the matter seriously, contemplating whether dreams might, in some cases, possess truth. Even Pliny the Elder, the encyclopedist whose scientific mind catalogued the natural world with rigorous detail, admitted that a dream featuring the ghost of Drusus had compelled him to write his history of the German wars. These men were not gullible. They were the intellectual giants of their age. Yet they lived in a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural had not been drawn as sharply as it is today. Plutarch, the moralist and philosopher, took an even more earnest approach. His account of Dion and Brutus both warned of their impending deaths by terrifying apparitions, suggests that ghosts could appear not only to the weak or fearful, but to strong, disciplined minds, Plutarch does not mock these stories. Instead, he asks why so many honorable and rational men reported supernatural encounters at pivotal moments in their lives. For him, the appearance of a specter was neither madness nor illusion, but a mysterious force that might accompany the turning points of human fate. This earnestness stands in contrast to the satire of Lucian, who filled his philipseudes with comical tales of gullible philosophers and absurd ghostly happenings. Through humor, Lucian reveals a timeless truth. People are irresistibly drawn to the marvelous. They love telling stories, embellishing them, adding layers of drama until nothing remains but an entertaining fiction. Even so, Lucian's mockery acknowledges the persistence of belief. No matter how much he ridiculed superstition, ghost stories continued to flourish. The ancient world also knew skeptics, none more striking than Democritus of Abdera, who deliberately lived in a tomb to disprove the existence of spirits. Yet even he became the target of mischievous youths who dressed in skeletal masks to frighten him, only to be met with calm amusement. But the Romans, practical as they were, found other ways to give form to their fears. Under the cruel Emperor Domitian, ghostly pageantry became a twisted tool of psychological torture. Young boys, naked and painted black, appeared like specters in his grotesque entertainments. These performances reveal how deeply the imagery of ghosts resonated with the Roman imagination. The fear of death, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the emperor's power, all merged in a single eerie spectacle. Despite their occasional theatricality, Greek and Roman ghost stories differ from many modern accounts in a significant way. Today, ghost narratives often emphasize comfort, closure, or a message of love from beyond the grave. But in antiquity, ghosts were rarely gentle. They appeared not to soothe, but to warn, terrify, or demand. Classical ghost encounters were deeply rooted in the belief that the dead carried unfinished business, violated justice, improper burial, or unresolved passions. Modern readers may find it curious that there are few ancient tales of spirits appearing to loved ones at the moment of death, despite the frequency of such reports today. Instead, their ghosts were more often restless and wrathful, shaped by a worldview where the afterlife was bleak, and the relationship between living and dead was maintained through obligation rather than affection. The early Christians would later reinterpret the supernatural through the lens of salvation and divine judgment. But in the purely pagan world of Greece and Rome, the dead remained ambiguous figures. They were neither wholly benevolent nor entirely malevolent. They inhabited a liminal space, reflecting both the hopes and anxieties of the living. What survived in their stories is the haunting sense that the ancients lived with the dead, not metaphorically, but as an everyday truth. The dead could enter dreams, disrupt homes, wander battlefields, or whisper warnings. They could be honored, feared, mocked, or doubted, but never fully ignored. These ghostly traditions reveal not ignorance, but a profound attempt to humanize death. For all their rational achievements, the ancients understood what we still grapple with today, that the memory of the dead clings to the world of the living, shaping our fears, our rituals, and our longing for meaning. To them, ghosts were not simply apparitions, they were mirrors reflecting humanity's deepest questions. And perhaps that is why their stories, though sparse, endure with such unsettling power. In the long tapestry of ancient storytelling, few themes carried the same enduring fascination as the haunted dwelling, those spaces where the boundary between the living and the dead seemed to thin, becoming porous enough for fear to slip through. Even in the Greco-Roman world, known for its rational philosophers and civic order, tales of haunted houses persisted, whispered from one generation to another. Perhaps it was the silence of nightfall, the shadows cast by lamplight, or the creaking of timbers in old villas that awakened a primitive terror. Whatever the cause, the ancients believed that certain spaces retained the imprint of past suffering, and that the spirits bound to those tragedies sometimes refused to leave. One of the most iconic haunting accounts, one that would shape the structure of ghost stories for centuries, comes from Pliny the Younger. He recounts the tale of an abandoned house in Athens, large and once elegant, now left desolate because no tenant dared remain within it. In the stillness of night, the clanking of chains would echo through its corridors, faint at first, but gradually growing louder as though something or someone dragged heavy shackles across the stone floors. Those who heard the sound described a chilling progression, the noise beginning far away, moving step by step through the house, until the apparition stood within sight. It came in the form of an elderly man, gaunt and emaciated, his beard long and unkempt, iron chains binding his hands and feet. The terror he invoked was not due to any violence, but rather to his silent persistence appearing night after night, never speaking, only staring with hollow, imploring eyes. The house became so feared that it could not be sold at any reasonable price. It was into this atmosphere of dread that the philosopher Athenodorus arrived. Unlike most, he did not shrink from the story, but approached it with a disciplined curiosity. He secured the house, set up his writing materials in the front court, and vowed to keep his mind anchored by work rather than fear. As the night deepened, the ghostly chains began their slow, rhythmic clatter. Athenodorus heard them, but refused to lift his eyes from his work until the sound entered the very room where he sat. Only then did he turn, encountering the spectre in its dreadful pallor. The apparition beckoned him, but the philosopher raised a hand, not in fear but in calm postponement, signaling that he needed a moment to finish his sentence, an almost humorous gesture in the face of the supernatural. When he finally followed the phantom into the courtyard, it vanished upon reaching an open space. Athenodorus marked the spot with leaves and grass, and at dawn summoned the authorities. Digging revealed a skeleton, still clasped within its rusted chains. After the remains were properly buried with due ceremony, the haunting ceased. This tale, preserved in Pliny's letters, would later influence medieval and modern ghost narratives, establishing the now familiar pattern of the haunted house, the restless spirit, the investigation, and the final laying to rest. But Pliny's story is not the only account of a haunting that blends fear with a sense of unresolved wrong. Robert Wadrow, a later collector of supernatural tales, preserved a remarkably similar narrative involving Gilbert Rule, the first principal of Edinburgh University. Rule sought lodging one stormy night in the Scottish Grampians, only to be placed in an abandoned house with a sinister reputation. Unlike the Athenian house, its haunting was not known through legend alone, but through unnerving experiences of previous occupants. Rule prayed for protection, extinguished his candles, and tried to sleep. But soon the door opened silently, and a shadowy figure entered. This ghost made no sound, spoke no word, but acted with a peculiar intent, lighting candles, inspecting the room, and attempting to draw the living man after it. When mere gestures failed, it placed burning coals on the wooden floor, forcing Rule to rise and follow. The apparition guided him to a stairway, descended into darkness, and vanished. The next day, authorities investigated and discovered human remains hidden beneath the stone where the ghost had disappeared. The crime seemed old, its murderer long gone. Yet justice, at least in the supernatural sense, had finally awakened. Unlike the classical story, this one ended not only with the discovery of bones, but with a confession. During a sermon preached by Rule, an elderly man broke down and admitted to the murder committed decades before. Here, the ghost's purpose echoed a universal theme: the dead return not for malice, but for truth. Haunting stories in antiquity were not limited to abandoned houses. Entire landscapes could be troubled by restless spirits. Plutarch tells of baths in Cheronea haunted after a murder took place there. The bathhouse became so notorious for eerie groans and apparitions that the doors were sealed shut. Even generations later, townspeople believed the area to be thick with supernatural presence. The persistence of these hauntings, whether real or imagined, suggests that for the ancients, certain locations absorbed trauma and radiated it back into the world. Roman playwrights understood this cultural fear well. In Plautus's Mostellaria, ghost lore is used as a tool for comedy, though the narrative elements remain traditional: a murdered traveler, an unburied corpse, and a house rendered unclean by unsatisfied spirits. Audiences laughed, but the humor worked precisely because the themes were so familiar. The threat of a haunting was part of everyday consciousness, whether or not one truly believed in ghosts. Even battlefields were haunted. Tacitus relates how the air above Jerusalem shimmered with ghostly armies during the Roman siege, while other writers speak of Marathon and the sites of wars against Attila as places where the clash of unseen combatants echoed on moonlit nights. The idea that warriors lingered where they died reflects the ancient conviction that violent death created spiritual turbulence energy that could not easily be laid to rest. Yet haunting did not always signify terror. In Philostratus's Heroica, the plain of Troy is described as a place where the ghosts of Homeric heroes continue to appear. Rather than fear, these spirits evoked awe. Locals interpreted their manifestations: dusty armor, sweat-drenched forms, or bloodied weapons as omens of drought, rain, or plague. The dead became part of the natural landscape, woven into the rhythms of agriculture and weather. Such stories reveal a truth about the ancient mind. Ghosts symbolize the persistence of memory. A haunted place was never simply haunted by a spirit, it was haunted by a story. Grief, injustice, glory, and trauma accumulated in certain locations, remaining there like imprints pressed into the earth. The presence of ghosts affirmed that the past was not lost, but continued to vibrate through the world of the living. And whether through fear, reverence, or fascination, the Greeks and Romans recognized that these lingering spirits carried a message, urging the living to remember, to reckon, and to understand the lives that came before them. Among the many shadows that stretched across the spiritual imagination of the ancient world, none loomed more mysteriously than necromancy, the practice of calling up the spirits of the dead. To the Greeks and Romans, death was not a sealed door, but a threshold, fragile and permeable, through which the living might sometimes reach into the realm below. Though many people feared ghosts and preferred to leave the dead undisturbed, others, out of desperation, curiosity, grief, or ambition, sought to summon the departed and compel them to speak. Necromancy occupied a forbidden yet irresistible region of belief, part religion, part sorcery, part psychological need. Its presence reaches as far back as the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Scriptures, where even King Saul, despite banning mediums, turned to the Witch of Endor in his darkest hour. When the spirit of Samuel arose and rebuked him, it set a precedent that later cultures echoed. The dead may be summoned, but their truths are rarely comforting. In the classical world, necromancy infiltrated myth, literature, and recorded history with a compelling mix of terror and awe. The elder Pliny, always eager to catalogue the strange as well as the natural, observes with characteristic dryness that spirits refuse to obey those who had freckles, a detail both humorous and revealing. It shows how deeply entwined necromantic lore was with folk beliefs, where even physical appearance could determine the authority one held over spirits. The landscape of Greece and Italy was dotted with places believed to be entrances to the underworld, gateways through which the living might communicate with the dead. Some were associated with mythic events, like the cavern at Heraclea in Pontus, where Hercules was said to have dragged Cerberus into the light. Others were tied to the abduction of Persephone. The Greeks believed that wherever the earth had opened to swallow her, a thin seam remained between our world and Hades. Eleusis, Colonus, and the fertile fields of Enna in Sicily each held such reputations. But it was perhaps the haunting pool of Cyane near Syracuse, where papyrus still grows, that carried the most evocative air of mystery, a calm mirror of water that, to the ancients, might have reflected the very boundary of life. Even lakes and seas could be imagined as portals, their depths concealing realms no mortal eye could penetrate. Natural phenomena, sulphurous fumes, dangerous vapors, sudden sinkholes further encouraged these associations. At Cumae, where Aeneas consulted the Sibyl, volcanic gases escaping from cracks in the earth filled the air with an odor that felt unearthly, a warning that the domain of shades lay just beneath the soil. And in Phrygia, near the temple of Cybele, there existed a plutonium, a cave so deadly that only priests could enter safely. Animals led toward its mouth collapsed instantly. Visitors believed the priests possessed some divine immunity. In truth, they may simply have understood the flow of carbon dioxide pooling in the cave's lower levels. Yet, in the ancient mind, such explanations did nothing to diminish the sense of dread that hung over these places. These sites, half natural wonder, half sacred terror, became centers for necromantic oracles. Pausanias describes a temple at Phigalia where Spartan generals consulted the souls of the dead. The most famous oracle of this sort lay by the river Acheron in Thesprotia, where Periander, the tyrant of Corinth, sought advice from the shade of his deceased wife. To commune with the dead, the supplicant descended into dark chambers, offered blood, and murmured incantations. In these subterranean spaces, a voice might respond from the darkness, or a spectral form might briefly appear, shaped by the flickering torchlight or by the imagination of the trembling visitor. For the ancients did not view necromancy as metaphor or illusion. They believed the dead carried knowledge, especially of the future, and that their perspectives were sharpened by their transition into the afterlife. That is why only newly dead souls were typically summoned. They still retained memory, emotion, and connection to the world they had left behind. Yet famous figures could be called regardless of age. Orpheus, Cecrops, even Achilles were believed to respond if the ritual was performed with sufficient power. Necromancy was deeply entangled with the origins of prophecy. Many early oracles were dedicated not to Apollo, but to Persephone and Pluto, whose symbols, especially the serpent, became emblems of prophecy itself. When Apollo later claimed the prophetic tradition, the coiled snake remained, draped around the tripod like a lingering whisper of the older, darker art. Descriptions survive of elaborate necromantic ceremonies, particularly those practiced near Lake Avernus. Cicero recounts that shades were summoned from the lake's grim mouth with salt blood, while Strabo cites Ephorus in describing a network of underground tunnels where priests manipulated the experience of visitors. These chambers may have allowed priests to observe supplicants through cracks or to project voices through hidden passages. Yet, however theatrical the setup, the emotional experience was profound for those who sought answers. To converse with the dead, even through trickery, fulfilled a deep psychological longing for closure, reassurance, or foreknowledge. Maximus of Tyre gives a haunting description of such rites. After the appropriate prayers and sacrifices, a thin, wavering form might appear, a shape difficult to discern, yet unmistakably human, speaking with a voice both familiar and distant. One need not be persuaded of literal truth to appreciate the emotional impact. Darkness, flickering light, solemn ritual, and the weight of personal grief could conjure powerful visions even without supernatural intervention. Necromancers of antiquity could be healers or manipulators, revered or feared. The Thessalian witches, notorious throughout classical literature, were said to draw down the moon, manipulate corpses, and force the dead to speak. Lucan's depiction of the witch Erichtho remains one of the most chilling in Roman poetry. She drags a corpse from a battlefield, fills its veins with warm blood, lashes it with a serpent to force its soul back, and compels it to speak of coming doom. Whether taken literally or symbolically, such stories reflect the profound dread and fascination surrounding death. Even emperors turned to necromancy. Nero, tormented by guilt and visions of his murdered mother, sought magic to silence her ghost. Caracalla attempted to summon the spirits of his father and brother for counsel, only to be met with silence, a silence more terrible than any curse. In all these accounts, necromancy reveals more than superstition. It exposes a deep yearning within the ancient world, the desire to bridge the abyss between life and death, to seek wisdom from those who had already crossed that boundary. Whether the rituals produced real visions or merely stirred the mind into imagining them matters less than the impulse behind them. For in the torchlit chambers of these ancient sanctuaries, people confronted the great fear that has accompanied humanity since its earliest days, the fear of the unknown beyond the grave, and in doing so, sought comfort, warning, or truth from voices they believed could no longer lie. Among the many ways the ancient Greeks and Romans believed the dead might return, none felt as intimate or as deeply human as their appearance in dreams. Compared to the dramatic hauntings of battlefields or the terrifying summons of necromancers, the visitation of a departed loved one during sleep possessed a gentler, more sorrowful quality. Dreams were understood as thresholds that the living could cross without fear, places where grief softened the boundary between worlds. To the ancients, sleep itself was a twin of death, hypnos and thanatos, brothers in myth and the encounter with a ghost in the stillness of night carried an emotional truth that no waking vision could match. The belief that the dead could appear in dreams to those they loved was not a poetic invention, but a conviction embedded deeply in the ancient heart. Inscriptions on tombs reveal this longing with moving simplicity. One grieving wife begged that her husband be permitted to visit her sometimes in sleep until she could join him in death. Such requests show that dreams were not viewed as illusions, but as fragile bridges, moments when the soul might step out of its mortal confines to meet another. The most profound exploration of this belief appears in Quintilian's 10th declamation, which centers on the return of a young boy's spirit to his mother. The story opens with sorrow. A mother, devastated by the loss of her son, delays his funeral as long as possible, clinging to the last physical connection to her child. On the night the funeral finally takes place, driven by despair and love, she breaks down and prays with such emotional force that she seems to shake even the gods of the underworld. And then, in the quiet hours before dawn, the boy appears. He does not come as a terrifying shade, nor as a distorted apparition, but exactly as he had been in life, warm, affectionate, and utterly real. He embraces her, comforts her, and remains with her until the first light of morning creeps into the room. Quintilian writes, "All that survives of a son will remain in close communion with his mother when he dies." The image is one of tenderness rather than horror, a ghost who returns not because he is restless or vengeful, but because his mother's love is too strong to ignore. The mother's grief transforms into a bittersweet solace. She longs for her husband to experience the same visitation, hoping he too may feel the presence of their lost child. But her husband reacts quite differently. The idea terrifies him. He imagines that any ghost, especially one so intimately connected, might be a dangerous omen. Without revealing his fear to his wife, he secretly consults a sorcerer, asking him to prevent the spirit from ever returning again. The sorcerer performs a binding ritual at the family tomb, sealing the boy's urn with spells and iron bands to confine his soul. He declares confidently that the spirit is now truly dead, imprisoned beneath the weight of magic and stone, unable to rise again. His words, meant as reassurance, instead deepen the tragedy. The mother, hearing that her son will never return, is consumed by grief, anew tormented by the thought that her child's loving spirit is now trapped, beating helplessly against the walls of his grave. The evocative Roman phrase, "Sit tibi terra levis," may the earth lie lightly upon you, takes on bitter irony here, for the boy's spirit is literally crushed beneath the weight of iron and spellcraft. Quintilian's declamation uses this story to explore the ethics of grief, love, and paternal authority, but its emotional force lies in its insight into ancient belief. Dreams were not merely psychological artifacts, they were encounters with the afterlife. They permitted continuity with loved ones and provided closure that death had denied. To banish a comforting apparition was not simply to interfere with a mother's grief. It was to deny a sacred connection between worlds. Another poignant example comes from Apuleius, who tells the story of Thrasyllus and Tlepolemus. Thrasyllus, driven by forbidden love for his friend's wife, murders Tlepolemus during a hunt and attempts to insinuate himself into the widow's affections. But the truth will not stay hidden. One night, Tlepolemus appears to his wife in a dream, revealing the circumstances of his death and pleading for justice. His presence is not monstrous but sorrowful, a plea rather than a threat. The dream becomes a catalyst for the widow's revenge, a revenge not only for murder but for the desecration of trust and love itself. In this tale, the dream vision is a vehicle of truth, a final gift from a wronged husband whose voice could only be heard through the fragile gate of sleep. Stories of dream visitations were not always tied to revenge or grief. The beautiful Roman poem, Culex, tells of a gnat who gives its life to warn a shepherd of a lurking snake. That night, the shepherd dreams of the gnat's ghost, who reproaches him for swatting it to death after it had saved him. The gnat's spirit then offers a vivid tour of the underworld rivers, shadows, punishments, and tormented souls, providing a miniature version of the great journeys found in Homer and Virgil. Though partly playful, the poem captures a core belief: even the smallest creature could possess a spirit capable of appearing in dreams. And dreams themselves were gateways to cosmic truths. Pausanias records the dream of Pindar, one of Greece's greatest poets. In his old age, he dreamt that Persephone appeared to him, lamenting that he had never written a hymn in her honor, but promising that he would do so when he came to her. Shortly afterward, Pindar died. Later, the spirit of Pindar appeared in a dream to a relative, dictating the very hymn he owed the goddess. Here, the dream vision is neither warning nor farewell, but a fulfillment of artistic destiny, suggesting that the dead continue to pursue their obligations and passions even after crossing into the other world. Across these stories, one theme persists. Dreams represented a liminal space where the burdens of the living and the unfinished business of the dead intertwined. They could offer comfort, reveal truths, inspire creative works, or exact moral justice. They were, in essence, a dialogue between worlds. For the ancients, to dream of the dead was not a sign of madness, but a deeply spiritual experience, one that illuminated the fears, loves, and hopes that persist beyond the grave. The dead appeared because they still cared, or still demanded, or still remembered, and the living, in receiving them, felt momentarily lifted into a realm where grief was eased or meaning restored, if only for the length of a single night. In the ancient world, the appearance of the dead did not always require rituals or dreams. Sometimes, according to Greek and Roman accounts, the dead returned, unbidden, stepping suddenly into the realm of the living with messages, warnings, accusations, or simply unresolved longing. These apparitions varied in form and temperament, but almost always arrived with a disquieting intensity, as though the boundary between death and life had briefly thinned enough for something forgotten to break through. For cultures steeped in solemn funerary rites and ancestral reverence, such manifestations carried a gravity that touched both the personal and the cosmic. Lucian, ever the satirist of superstition, provides a tale that mixes humor with the eeriness of domestic haunting. He describes a man whose wife, dead for 20 days, returned to him not as an ethereal shadow, but as a presence capable of physical interaction. She appeared while he was reading Plato's Phaedo, a text devoted to the immortality of the soul. The irony would not have been lost on Lucian. The man, seeing her materialize, rushed forward and embraced her, flinging aside any philosophical doubts. She reprimanded him not for mourning or disbelief, but for an almost comically mundane oversight. One of her golden slippers had not been burned with her possessions during the funeral. The ghost, indignant that her attire had been left incomplete in death, demanded a correction. Before she could press the issue further, A small Maltese puppy burst from beneath the bed and barked furiously, causing her to vanish instantly. The missing slipper was discovered exactly where she said it lay. It was burned the next day, and she did not appear again. Though humorous, the story reveals a deeper truth about the concerns that haunted everyday Romans. For women of the ancient world, whose social identity was often tied to their household objects and personal adornments, something as simple as a missing piece of clothing could be invested with symbolic weight. A spirit deprived of proper burial rites was thought to linger restlessly, whether that deprivation involved a golden shoe or an entire body. The underlying fear was the same: neglect in death might lead to unrest in the afterlife. This theme emerges again in the story of Periander, the tyrant of Corinth, who attempted to consult his deceased wife, Melissa. Melissa refused to answer any questions until she had been given suitable clothing. Her body had been disgracefully placed in a clay pit rather than burned with proper honor. To appease her, Periander ordered all the women of Corinth to gather their finest garments, which he burned in a massive pyre as an offering. The extravagance of this act underscores the anxiety surrounding the dead. Even tyrants, who held absolute power in life, feared the resentment of those who had crossed into the next realm. The impulse for spirits to return with domestic complaints was not uniquely classical. An account from the 19th century tells of a Presbyterian woman repeatedly visited by the ghost of a recently deceased washerwoman. The spirit urged her to pay a small debt, 3 shillings and 10 pence, that she had left unsettled with a grocer. Once the debt was paid, the ghost never returned. Such stories, though separated by centuries, reveal how deeply the idea persists that the dead return to rectify unfinished earthly obligations. More dramatic apparitions appear in classical accounts when the dead had been violently killed or unjustly treated, as with the ruthless Roman emperors. Pliny the Younger records the haunting of Fannius, who was writing a history of Nero. Nero's ghost appeared at night, reading through the chapters of the manuscript in eerie silence. Fannius interpreted this visitation as a sign that he would not live to complete the work, an omen that proved true. The haunting of tyrants, or by tyrants, reflects the belief that violent or dishonorable deaths created the most restless spirits. This notion extended into medieval and early modern lore, where Nero's ghost was thought to wander the outskirts of Rome until a church was built near his burial site to pacify him. Caligula, one of Rome's most infamous rulers, also became a ghostly figure after his assassination. His body had been hastily buried without proper rites. Servants soon reported chilling encounters, doors opening on their own, footsteps in empty corridors, and sightings of Caligula's angry shade wandering the Lamian gardens. Only after his sisters returned from exile to complete the necessary funeral rituals did the haunting cease. Even the most feared emperor could not escape the necessity of proper burial, a rule seemingly imposed by both the living and the dead. The apparitions associated with military or political catastrophe held special significance. Before the fatal confrontation with Otho, Galba's ghost was said to appear to the emperor, driving him in terror from his chambers. Otho, tormented by guilt and stress, believed he was being punished for treachery. Such visions often reflect deep psychological distress. Yet, to the ancient mind, they were unmistakable warnings. The dead, still tied to the affairs of the world, sought to influence the living. Ghost stories tied to early Greek mythology reveal the roots of these fears. Pelops' charioteer Achilles, for example, died en route to Pisa and appeared to Pelops in a dream, begging for burial. When Pelops complied, Kelos returned again, this time with gratitude, and with advice that led Pelops to victory in the fateful chariot race for Hippodamia. But in an ironic twist, Pelops later betrayed another charioteer, Myrtilus, who had helped him win. Myrtilus cursed him with his dying breath, and that curse echoed down the generations of Pelops's descendants, haunting his family like a dark inheritance. This intertwining of ghostly presence, family destiny, and moral obligation reflects how deeply the ancients connected the supernatural with ethical conduct. Similarly, the poet Simonides once buried a stranger's body found along the shore, only to be visited later by the man's ghost in a dream. The apparition warned Simonides not to sail on a particular ship. He obeyed, and the ship sank shortly after leaving harbor. This story belongs to a broader cycle of Grateful Dead narratives, where kindness shown to the deceased is repaid with supernatural protection. Such tales preserved the hope that benevolence carried beyond mortality, that good deeds created bonds stronger than death. Apparitions also appeared at the moment of death or immediately after, as in the strange case of Aristeas of Proconnesus. He collapsed, lifeless, in a workshop, yet travelers claim to have seen him alive in another city on the same day. Later, he reappeared years after his supposed death and instructed the people of Metapontum to honor him alongside Apollo. The ancients treasured such accounts as proof that the soul could travel, depart, and return with ease, whether returning to settle debts, utter warnings, seek justice, or simply relive a memory. The dead of ancient Greece and Rome wandered freely through the stories of the living. Their apparitions revealed a world where death was neither silent nor remote, but an active presence shaping fate, inspiring fear, and reminding humanity that the past does not rest quietly. In these tales, the dead do not simply linger. They demand to be acknowledged, understood, and remembered. In the ancient Mediterranean imagination, not all ghosts return to lament unfinished business or to soothe grieving hearts. Some returned with purpose urgent, prophetic, and often terrifying. These were the warning apparitions, towering figures, spectral women of colossal stature, or spirits cloaked in dread. They did not drift into the world of the living by accident. They arrived as harbingers of doom, embodiments of fate, and voices of the unseen powers that shaped human destiny. To Greeks and Romans, who viewed the cosmos as pulsing with signs and omens, these warnings from beyond the grave or beyond nature itself were not merely supernatural episodes. They were part of the moral and political fabric of the world. One of the most striking examples comes from Pliny the Younger, who recounts the vision granted to Quintus Curtius Rufus. As a young man serving under the governor of Africa, Rufus strolled through a colonnade after sunset when a gigantic female figure materialized before him. She towered above human scale, her presence unmistakably divine or demonic. She declared that she was Africa itself, the spirit of the land in which he walked, and foretold his destiny with chilling precision. He would return to Rome, rise to high office, and eventually come back to Africa as its governor, only to die there. Every detail unfolded exactly as she predicted. When he stepped onto African soil for the final time, witnesses even claimed that the giant woman appeared once more, as though to collect the debt of fate she had pronounced. This pattern appears again and again in classical literature, great consequences echoing through the appearance of great figures. Dion, the noble but ill-fated statesman of Syracuse, encountered one such apparition while contemplating the future of his city. In the quiet of evening, he saw at the end of his portico a colossal woman, terrifying in form, sweeping the stones with a broom as though purging the place of life itself. To Dion, the meaning was unmistakable. Fate was clearing the path for disaster. Shortly after, his only son died tragically, and Dion himself fell victim to conspirators. Plutarch, who retells the story, treats the apparition not as folly, but as a reflection of what thoughtful men of the time believed, that such visions were not phantoms of a disordered mind, but emissaries from the unseen world. These giant women, half fury, half oracle, appear repeatedly in accounts from the Roman Empire. During Drusus's ambitious German campaigns, he was preparing to cross the Elbe, eager to explore lands no Roman had yet conquered. Suddenly, a towering woman blocked his path and cried out, "Insatiable Drusus, how far will you go? You are not fated to see all that lies ahead. Return now, for the end of your life is near." Drusus, shaken to the core, obeyed. Yet her warning was not meant to avert his doom, only to announce it. He died soon afterward, well before reaching the Rhine. In these tales, the supernatural does not always intervene to save. Sometimes it simply confirms what cannot be escaped. Dio Cassius mentions similar prodigies during the reign of Macrinus. Before that emperor's fall, a monstrous female spectre appeared to several people, predicting calamities far greater than anything they had yet endured. Her prophecy was fulfilled in the cruel and chaotic rule of Elagabalus, whose tenure seemed to validate the darkest warnings from the invisible realm. To ancient audiences, these episodes reinforced a worldview in which destiny was both revealed and enforced by ghostly intermediaries. No storyteller treats warning apparitions with more theatrical flair than Lucian in his Philipseutis. Here, Eucrates, who claims to have seen thousands of ghosts in his life encounters, perhaps the most extravagant apparition in ancient literature, resting in a vineyard at midday. His dog suddenly leapt up, barking furiously. Eucrates looked around and saw a woman at least 300 feet tall, brandishing a sword the length of a ship's mast. Her legs were scaled like a dragon's, and snakes coiled over her shoulders. Yet Eucrates, equipped with a magical ring forged from iron taken from the cross of an executed criminal, did not panic. He turned the ring, and the earth split open beneath the monstrous woman, swallowing her entirely. The chasm revealed the entire underworld beneath his feet, an eerie, sprawling vista with the shades of the blessed reclining among meadows of asphodel. Among them, Eucrates even recognized his own father in the garments he had been buried in. Moments later, the chasm sealed. Whether Lucian intended satire or terror, the story demonstrates the ease with which ancient tales mixed cosmic symbolism with earthy humor. More human than monstrous are the apparitions associated with imminent natural disaster. Trajan, according to Dio Cassius, was saved from a devastating earthquake at Antioch because a phantom suddenly appeared and commanded him to leave his house by the window. He obeyed, and the building collapsed moments later. A similar tale is told of Simonides, who narrowly escaped death when a ghost warned him that the house he slept in was about to fall. For individuals who lived in cities prone to earthquakes, sudden storms, and floods, the idea that a ghost might arrive as a savior was strangely comforting, a sign that the boundary between worlds softened when life hung in the balance. Not all warning apparitions spoke. Some communicated through actions. Pliny the Younger records a strange case involving a slave named Marcus, whose hair was cut by unseen hands while he slept. The first time, he awoke to find hair scattered around his bed. The second time, he witnessed figures dressed in white cutting it. Pliny, always cautious in interpretation, wondered if the event foreshadowed his own political fate, since those awaiting trial traditionally cut their hair in mourning. Though no dire consequence followed, the episode shows how even the smallest unexplained event could unsettle a Roman accustomed to reading omens in everything from bird flight to lightning strikes. These stories reflect a world in which supernatural messages were woven into daily life, politics, and warfare. A warning apparition was not dismissed as fantasy but regarded as part of the great web of signs that guided human decisions. The figures who appeared, whether spirits of the land, ghosts of the wronged, or monstrous guardians of fate, served as intermediaries between the mortal and immortal orders. Their warnings did not always prevent disaster, but they lent meaning to it, suggesting that even in tragedy there was a pattern recognized by the universe. To the Greeks and Romans, the presence of such apparitions confirmed that humans did not stand alone in their struggles. Forces older and larger than life itself watched, judged, and occasionally intervened. Whether these figures were divine, ghostly, or manifestations of human conscience hardly mattered. What mattered was the message, and the uneasy sense that destiny always spoke, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes in the towering form of a woman sweeping the threshold of fate. Among the most unsettling beliefs that threaded through the ancient world was the conviction that the dead could be summoned back to speak with the living. This was not a poetic notion or a metaphor for memory. It was a literal expectation. The Greeks and Romans, along with many neighboring cultures, believed that necromancy, calling up the souls of the departed, could unveil secrets of the past or reveal the future. These rites, often performed in the dead of night, were steeped in dread and awe. To meddle with the departed was to trespass into a realm governed by divine powers. Yet it was a trespass many were willing to make, for knowledge they could gain no other way. The Hebrew scriptures themselves record such a rite. King Saul, having forbidden witchcraft across his kingdom, nevertheless sought out the witch of Endor when fear overwhelmed him. Disguised, he asked her to summon the spirit of Samuel, who rose from the earth only to rebuke Saul and foretell his downfall. The familiarity of this story to later cultures helped legitimize necromancy as something even kings had resorted to when desperation clouded judgment. In the Greco-Roman world, necromancy took on a ritual form shaped by myth, geography, and a complex network of sacred sites. Pliny the Elder even mentions that spirits would not obey those afflicted with freckles, a curious, almost humorous detail that reveals both superstition and the attempt to codify occult knowledge. Certain places were thought to be literal gateways to the underworld. At Heraclea, in Pontus, a psychomanteon, an oracle of the dead, was famed for its supposed connection to the myth of Heracles, dragging Cerberus to the upper world. Other legendary entrances included Eleusis, where mysteries of life and death were enacted; Colonus, the tragic endpoint of Oedipus's wanderings; and Enna in Sicily, where Persephone was said to have been seized by Hades. Lakes, caves, chasms, and sulphurous springs were all interpreted as mouths of the underworld. Nature itself seemed to assist these beliefs, toxic vapors rising from fissures near Naples, for example, caused animals to collapse instantly, strengthening the belief that the threshold to Hades lay just beneath. The most famous of these death gates was at Cumae. There, the Sibyl guided Aeneas toward the realm of departed souls. Yet beyond myth, real priests capitalized on these eerie landscapes. At Hierapolis in Phrygia, a plutonium emitted lethal vapors that killed any living creature except the priests of Cybele, who had somehow learned how to survive within the noxious air. Cicero himself claimed to have seen these deadly chasms, regarding them with the same mixture of curiosity and fear that travelers might feel upon witnessing a miracle that defied explanation. Necromancy also took place inside specially constructed temples, where shadows and firelight amplified the atmosphere of dread. A psychomantic shrine on the banks of the Acheron allowed people to consult the dead, while other temples in Arcadia drew mourners seeking visions or prophecies. Ancient psychics knew well how to manipulate perception. Dim lighting, subterranean hallways, echoing chambers, and hidden vents helped create the illusion of voices emerging from the dark. Sometimes, the priests needed only a mastery of suggestion or ventriloquism to produce a convincing revelation. Yet for those who sought answers, it scarcely mattered whether the mechanisms were supernatural or theatrical. What mattered was the belief, one that philosophers like Plato and dramatists like Euripides reinforced, that the newly dead remained intimately connected with the world of the living and could be persuaded to reveal hidden truths. Souls recently departed were preferred, for their emotional ties to the living were still warm. But even ancient heroes, long dead, could be summoned with sufficient ritual power. Apollonius of Tyana claimed to have called forth Achilles himself, not by blood offerings, but by invoking him with prayers used by mystics in India. Achilles appeared as a towering youth, expanding in height until he resembled a living statue of divine beauty. Apollonius asked him 5 questions about the Trojan War, questions scholars still debate today, and Achilles answered each one before vanishing at the crowing of a cock, the signal that ghosts must flee before dawn. In the Roman imagination, necromancy belonged not merely to myth, but also to politics. Accusations of conjuring the dead often appeared in legal and rhetorical attacks. Cicero accused his enemy Vatinius of sacrificing the entrails of boys in order to compel the manes to speak likely slander, but revealing how deeply necromancy was woven into the cultural fabric. Pliny notes that young aristocrats experimented with raising shades by night, treating the practice as both a forbidden thrill and a demonstration of daring. Tacitus recounts the case of a nobleman who attempted to raise a ghost for divination, slipping deeper into madness after the attempt. Some of the most vivid accounts come from literary works, where necromancy is depicted with theatrical macabre detail. Lucan's Pharsalia offers the famous episode of Erichtho, a fearsome Thessalian witch whom Sextus Pompeius consulted. Erichtho lived among the dead, feeding on corpses and practicing her arts in deserted tombs. She dragged the freshly slain body of a soldier into her cave, filled its broken chest with warm blood, lashed it with serpents, chanted unholy invocations, and forced the reluctant soul back into its rotting form. The corpse, trembling and half-living, revealed the future of Pompeius's campaign before finally collapsing into true death. Statius and Apuleius describe similar rituals, emphasizing the violence inflicted upon both body and soul rituals in which the dead were not honored but coerced, bound by spells, and forced into unnatural obedience. Many ancient writers acknowledged that the dead resisted such summons. To be pulled back toward the earthly realm was painful for them. The body was a prison they had joyfully shed, and to re-inhabit it, even temporarily, was seen as torment. The undead soldier, revived by Erichtho, could barely speak. The corpse awakened in Apuleius's tale begged to know why he had not been allowed to rest in peace. These stories express a chilling idea. Humanity's desire for knowledge could violate even the repose of death. But necromancy was not always a dark art. For some, it served as a means of healing grief or resolving injustice. In the wake of murder or betrayal, summoning a spirit could offer clarity, closure, or at least confirmation that moral wrongs did not vanish into silence. Caracalla, tormented by the guilt of killing his brother Geta, attempted to call up Geta's ghost several times, seeking forgiveness or relief from haunting dreams. The spirits refused him. Only the shade of Commodus spoke, and his message was filled with dread, as though the dead themselves recoiled from the emperor's crimes. Across these tales, necromancy emerges as a powerful metaphor for humanity's yearning for answers, for justice, for connection with those who have vanished. Yet it also reveals a deeper fear that the dead, once disturbed, might not return to their quiet realm willingly. The ancient world believed the grave was not an ending but a boundary, and necromancy was the dangerous art of crossing it, an art that promised wisdom but demanded both courage and a willingness to confront the horrors hidden in the shadowed spaces between life and death. The visions of the dead that visited the Greeks and Romans in sleep held a special place in their supernatural imagination. Though dreams could be deceptive, there lingered a persistent belief that loved ones who had crossed beyond the veil often returned at night with messages, warnings, or yearning gestures of affection. These encounters were not dismissed as mere illusions of grief-stricken minds. Rather, they were seen as profound communications from the shadowed world beyond life moments, in which the dead brushed against the living with an intimacy that waking reality rarely afforded. Inscriptions retrieved from ancient tombs reveal this longing clearly. On one poignant grave marker, a widow begs that her departed husband be allowed to visit her in dreams. "Visit me as often as the gods permit, and soon may I join thee." Such sentiments were not unusual. Dreams were viewed as a bridge between realms, a liminal moment when the soul, unfettered by the distractions of daylight, could perceive truths hidden from the waking world. Even the most skeptical philosophers accepted that dreams carried weight, if not always literal messages from the beyond, then at least reflections of deep emotional truths. Quintilian, the eminent Roman rhetorician, captured this belief in one of the most striking accounts of a dream visitation. In his 10th declamation, he describes a family devastated by the death of a beloved son. At the funeral, prolonged at the mother's desperate insistence, the boy appeared to her in a dream on the very night his body was laid to rest. He remained beside her until dawn, embracing her with the same tender affection he had shown in life. Quintilian comments that all that survives of a son will remain in communion with his mother when he dies, suggesting that maternal love alone could breach the boundaries between life and death. But this tender encounter soon collided with fear. The father, unlike the mother, experienced dread at the thought of a ghost visiting him. Though he said nothing to his grieving wife, he secretly summoned a sorcerer to seal their son's tomb so thoroughly that his spirit would be unable to escape. The sorcerer tightened the grave with spells and iron bands, declaring triumphantly, Now he is truly dead. Now he cannot return. When the mother discovered what had been done, she was overcome with anguish. Her son's spirit, which had defied the gods below to comfort her, was now imprisoned by magic and stone, unable to reach her again. The image of a soul beating helplessly against its tomb became a vivid illustration of the Roman fear that death could be made even more final through human interference. This belief in dream visitations also appears in more romantic and tragic tales. Apuleius recounts the story of Thrasyllus and the murdered Tlepolemus, whose widow remains one of the most haunting figures of ancient literature. Thrasyllus, consumed with jealousy, killed his friend Tlepolemus during a hunt, hoping to claim the widow for himself. The grieving woman refused all food, longing only for death so she could be reunited with her husband. When her parents finally persuaded her to attend to her health, Thrasyllus pressed his suit, certain she would eventually yield. But then, in the darkness of night, Tlepolemus's ghost appeared to her, recounting the story of his murder and urging her to avenge him. She embraced her grief as purpose. Pretending to soften toward Thrasyllus, she arranged a night meeting, drugged his wine, and let him sink into a deep sleep. Then she blinded him with a hairpin, declaring that blindness was too gentle a fate for a man who had robbed her of life and love. Thrasyllus, maddened by guilt and despair, later sealed himself inside her husband's tomb and starved himself to death. In this tale, the ghost is not merely a messenger, but a catalyst, guiding justice from beyond the grave. Another famous story comes from Pausanias and tells of Cleonice, a young woman captured by the Spartan Pausanias, the celebrated hero of the Persian Wars. Brought to his chamber reluctantly and against her will, she approached quietly so as not to wake him, but the noise startled him, half asleep and afraid for his life. He lashed out with his sword and killed her. After her death, the ghost of Cleonice appeared to him each night, whispering, "Go to the fate which pride and lust prepare." Terrified, Pausanias traveled to Heraclea to summon her spirit and beg forgiveness. She appeared once more, telling him that he would soon be rid of his troubles. Within weeks he met his end, proving her prophecy true. Her haunting was not driven by vengeance but by the cold inevitability of fate, carried on the lips of a wronged soul. Not all ancient dream apparitions were tragic or vengeful. Some served as poetic meditations on gratitude. One of the loveliest examples appears in Virgil's early poem, Culex, where a humble gnat sacrifices its life to save a shepherd from a deadly snake. That night, the gnat's ghost appears in a dream, recounting its descent to the underworld and reproaching the shepherd for the unintentional cruelty of swatting his tiny savior. The shepherd, moved and remorseful, constructs a small tomb for the gnat, decorating it with flowers and carving an inscription in its honor. In this gentle tale, the apparition is neither menacing nor sorrowful, but a reminder that even the smallest of creatures can leave an echo in the human heart. A similarly gentle vision is recorded about the great poet Pindar. In his old age, he dreamt that Persephone visited him, telling him that she alone among the goddesses had not been honored in his songs, but that he would pay his debt when he reached her realm. Shortly thereafter, Pindar died. Not long after his passing, a relative claimed that Pindar had appeared to her in a dream, singing the very hymn promised to Persephone. She memorized it and wrote it down upon waking. Whether this was divine inspiration or the deep affection of family for a revered poet did not matter. The story illustrates the belief that the boundary between living and dead was porous, especially in matters of art and devotion. These episodes reveal the full spectrum of ancient experiences with dream apparitions, from love and longing to justice, gratitude, and prophecy. The dreams were not viewed as illusions, but as encounters that carried emotional and moral weight. For the Greeks and Romans, the dead did not disappear into silence. They lingered at the edges of sleep, whispering truths, offering comfort, stirring guilt, or guiding the living toward their destined paths. In dreams, the ancients found a realm where life and death conversed freely, where the heart's deepest mysteries were revealed, and where memories became voices that refused to fade. The ancient world brimmed with ghost stories, yet when we examine them closely, we notice that many lack the emotional resonance or psychological complexity expected in modern supernatural tales. They are often brief, skeletal accounts, startling, yes, but lacking the tenderness or tragic beauty found in contemporary narratives collected by psychical researchers. And yet, hidden among these spare classical stories, we occasionally encounter a gem of profound atmosphere and haunting imagery. One such tale comes from Phlegon of Tralles, a freedman of Hadrian, whose writings preserve several marvels, some grotesque and others surprisingly moving. Among the surviving accounts, one narrative stands out, a story of love, death, and the inexplicable persistence of the human spirit. Before reaching that tale, however, we encounter other ancient accounts that help frame the classical view of ghostly apparitions. One relates the mysterious death of a child born after his father had already passed away. At a public gathering, where the grim decision was to kill the infant, the dead father suddenly appeared, seized the child, tore it apart, and devoured it, leaving only the head behind. The macabre spectacle grew even stranger when the severed head began to speak, issuing prophecies. This bizarre legend reflects the tendency of ancient storytellers to blend horror with supernatural fate, showing how spirits could intrude violently into the mortal world. Such narratives prepared readers for the great story that followed, a tale blending tenderness and terror in equal measure. The story of Philinian and Machates, preserved in fragmented form by Phlegon and clarified by later scholars, is set in Amphipolis during the reign of Philip II of Macedon. The narrative unfolds through a letter supposedly written by Hipparchus to Aridaeus, blending eyewitness testimony with official concern. Philinian, the daughter of Demostratus and Charito, had been married only 6 months when she died, taking her beauty, youth, and passionate spirit with her to the tomb. But death, in this story, refuses to hold her. Machates, a young Thessalian guest in her parents' home, became the unlikely center of the unfolding mystery. One night, a nurse entered his chamber and was startled to find a woman sitting with him. She recognized Philinian, though the girl had been dead for half a year. Terrified, she ran to Charito, breathlessly insisting that their daughter lived again and was with the young visitor. Charito, overwhelmed by grief and disbelief, dismissed the story until the nurse insisted that she come and see for herself. Still trembling, she approached the chamber door, but too much time had passed. The lamp burned low, and the pair had fallen asleep. In the dim light, Charito could just discern the form of her daughter, but uncertainty held her silent. She chose to wait until morning to confront Machates. but dawn brought nothing but disappointment. Felinian had slipped away into the night, unseen by any member of the household. When questioned, Machates reluctantly confessed that Felinian had indeed been visiting him nightly. He had believed she was merely coming to him without her parents' knowledge, for she ate, drank, and spoke as any living woman would. To prove his story, he produced tokens she had, left her golden ring, and a beautifully wrought girdle. These were objects buried with her, and Charito instantly recognized them. The grief she thought she had exhausted surged anew, raw and hysterical, as if she were losing her daughter a second time. That evening, Demostratus and Charito hid themselves nearby, waiting for the moment Felinian might return. When she appeared, walking calmly into the room with the familiar grace of her living days, their shock turned to wonder, then to fear. Her voice was cold but not cruel as she confronted her parents. "Cruel are you, who begrudge me 3 days with this stranger. It harmed no one. I came with heaven's permission. And now, because of your intrusion, I must return to the place appointed for me." And with that, she collapsed and died again, this time without possibility of denial. Her body lay lifeless on the bed, warm at first, then cooling as the household wailed in horror and confusion. Word spread quickly through Amphipolis. By morning, the entire city gathered, debating whether this was a divine sign, a monstrous deception, or a miracle of love that defied explanation. The officials decided to open her tomb to determine whether her body still lay inside. When they did, they found the bier empty, save for the ring and the gilded cup Machates had gifted her during her first night's return. The absence of her corpse confirmed that the woman who had visited Machates was no impostor, no trick of senses, but the girl herself, risen for reasons beyond mortal comprehension. The crowd rushed back to the house, where her body still lay, unmistakably Felinian, as real in death as she had been in life, tormented by grief and fear, perhaps of divine punishment, perhaps of love. Lost Machates killed himself, unable to bear the weight of the supernatural encounter that had transformed his life. His death brought a tragic closure to the strange affair, but the city was far from calm. Panic gripped the citizens, for no precedent existed for such a violation of the natural order. Hellas, the most reputable diviner in Amphipolis, interpreted the event with grave seriousness. Felinian must be buried outside the city boundaries, he declared, for her presence had polluted sacred ground. Ritual purification was demanded to appease Hermes of the underworld and the Eumenides, guardians of the dead's peace. Only through sacrifice, purification, and reconsecration could the city restore the wall between the living and the dead that had been so disturbingly breached. The tale's final lines preserve a sense of the awe it inspired. "If the king requires a report of these events," the writer says, "I will send those who witnessed each detail." The tone is official, yet trembling with the awareness that this was no ordinary occurrence. It was a haunting that defied logic, a romance that crossed death's threshold, and a tragedy that left the ancient world with one of its rarest and most compelling ghost stories. This tale, later inspiring Goethe's Bride of Corinth, stands among the few classical narratives that resonate emotionally with modern audiences. It captures fear, yearning, love, and horror woven together with uncanny beauty. While many ancient ghost stories feel distant or skeletal, the story of Felinian and Machates pulses with life and with the haunting suggestion that death is not always the final word. The ancient world never lacked stories of apparitions who appeared at moments of danger or death, serving as omens or silent witnesses to catastrophe. But equally compelling were tales in which spirits manifested to accompany heroes, warn armies, or echo the trauma of battle long after the clash of swords had ended. These were not the gentle dream visitations of grieving families nor the conjured shades of necromancers. They were spectral presences bound to landscapes soaked with memory, ghosts interwoven with history itself. And as we examine these accounts, we sense how strongly the Greeks and Romans believed that violence left its imprint upon the earth, that where great suffering occurred, the dead lingered like an echo, refusing to fade. One of the earliest and most dramatic examples appears in the siege of Jerusalem, recorded by Tacitus. During the final days of the struggle, when tensions pressed upon the besieged city like an iron weight, reports spread that armies were seen fighting in the sky, ghostly hosts clashing above the clouds, as though reenacting celestial battles that mirrored the chaos below. These visions, interpreted by some as portents of doom and by others as divine intervention, reveal the ancient belief that war opened rifts between worlds. When cities trembled and empires fractured, the veil between life and death thinned, allowing the unseen to reveal itself in terrifying grandeur. Centuries later, after a great battle against Attila and the Huns near Rome, survivors claimed that the ghosts of the slain continued fighting for 3 days and nights. Witnesses insisted they heard the clashing of armor, the neighing of spectral horses, and the cries of warriors locked in combat. To the ancients, such accounts were credible because battlefields were viewed as charged spaces, realms in which the violent severing of life left spiritual wounds that could not easily close. The land remembered, and so did the spirits who had spilled their blood upon it. The plain of Marathon was no exception. Pausanias, the tireless traveler and recorder of Greek customs, writes that on certain nights one could hear the thunder of phantom hooves and the shouts of warriors locked in perpetual struggle. The Athenians, who honored the fallen as heroes, believed these spectral battles served as an eternal reminder of their ancestors' valor. Yet Pausanias warns that anyone who went deliberately to witness the phenomenon never met with good fortune. It was permissible only to stumble upon these ghostly reenactments by accident, as though the dead tolerated accidental onlookers but resented curiosity. Such stories set the stage for an even more extraordinary account preserved in Philostratus's Heroica. In this strange, dreamlike treatise, the spirits of Homeric heroes continue to inhabit the region around Troy, intervening in the lives of local farmers, guiding the growth of vines, and even sending omens of weather and plague. The narrator, a humble vine dresser, claims to live under the protection of Protesilaus, the first Greek warrior to leap ashore at Troy and the first to die. According to the vine dresser, Protesilaus appeared in a dream to a wealthy landowner who sought to seize his property. In the vision, the hero struck the intruder blind, halting his predatory ambitions. Since that day, Protesilaus guided the vine dresser's work, kept away wild beasts, and continued to punish those who acted unjustly. The vine dresser insists that the plain near Troy teems with the shades of long-dead heroes. They appear at night wearing armor and plumed helmets, their forms ghostly but recognizable. The local people watch them anxiously, for the hero's appearance carries prophetic meaning. If the ghosts seem dusty, they foretell drought. If they appear sweaty, rain will follow. Blood upon their arms signals plague. Thus, The spirits of Homeric warriors shape not only legend, but the rhythms of daily life, guiding farmers as surely as they once guided armies. Among these spectral figures, Achilles stands apart. The vine dresser recounts tales of sailors glimpsing him on the White Isle, an island said to have risen from the Black Sea at the request of Thetis so that her son might have a sanctuary after death. There, Achilles dwells with Helen, finally united after lifetimes of separation. At night, sailors claim to hear their songs drifting across the water, melodies of love, war, and the verses of Homer. Some report seeing Achilles himself dancing a war dance in golden armor, or hearing the neigh of otherworldly horses echoing across the waves. These visions blend myth and haunting into a single tapestry in which the boundary between legend and ghost story dissolves entirely. Other heroes appear as well, their memories carried in tales of vengeance and sorrow. Ajax, known for his tragic madness, was believed to punish shepherds who mocked his earthly failures. When one shepherd insulted him near his tomb, a terrible voice echoed from the darkness. Another boy who taunted Achilles' statue met an even worse fate while driving his ponies near a brook. He saw a warrior rise from the water, shouting in an unknown tongue. The boy was overtaken and drowned, his ponies dragged down with him. The story's cruelty reflects a belief that the heroes of old, even in death, could wield power with the same ferocity they showed in life. At times, these apparitions took on gentler forms. Sailors who approached the White Isle with reverence found protection. Sudden winds warned them of approaching storms, and animals appeared at the altar ready for sacrifice without human prompting. Yet the spirits also enforced strict boundaries. No one was permitted to sleep on the island, and no woman could step ashore. These rules preserved the sanctity of Achilles and Helen's eternal union, emphasizing that even in death, the heroes demanded respect. One of the most human stories concerns Leonymus of Croton, who was mysteriously wounded during a campaign. When the injury refused to heal, he sought guidance from the oracle at Delphi. The prophetess instructed him to sail to the White Isle, where Ajax himself would heal him. Leonymus obeyed and claimed the hero appeared to him, restored his strength, and revealed secrets of the afterlife. Whether this was a ghostly visitation or a symbolic journey matters little. What mattered to the ancients was the idea that the dead could guide the living toward healing when all earthly remedies failed. In these stories, the dead remain part of the landscape, part of the fabric of fate, and part of the living world's memory. They fight battles long finished, punish insults long forgotten, and appear to those who respect or offend them. The Greeks and Romans believed that great souls did not vanish, they imprinted themselves upon the earth, returning as guardians, omens, or restless echoes of past glories. Their presence, whether comforting or terrifying, reminded the living that time does not erase every wound, and that some spirits linger wherever history has left its deepest marks. The ancient world possessed a deep fear of souls deprived of rest, those who wandered because their deaths had been untimely, violent, or unaccompanied by proper burial rites. These restless spirits were believed to be far more dangerous than the peaceful dead honored through family cults and state ceremonies. Unlike gentle ancestral shades who returned during festivals or whispered through dreams, these beings prowled through tombs, crossroads, and abandoned places, carrying with them the unresolved violence of their deaths. To Greek and Roman minds, such spirits did not merely represent tragedy. They embodied the disorder that erupted when the boundaries between life and death were disrupted. The Greeks classified the unquiet dead into three main categories. First were the auroi, souls who died before their natural time, children, youths, or any who had not completed their allotted span. These spirits were believed to drift aimlessly until the years they were destined to live had passed. Then came the bi othanatoi, those who met violent deaths by murder, suicide, or accident. Their souls were thought to be turbulent, clinging to the place of death, seeking vengeance or justice. Finally, the ataphoi were the unburied, doomed to wander for 100 years before Charon would ferry them across the Styx. These spirits, deprived even of the simplest funeral gesture, a handful of earth, were considered the most dangerous of all. The hymn to Hecate describes these spirits following the goddess in ghostly retinues, appearing in human form as they joined her nightly revels. Murdered men, executed criminals, and victims of injustice all drifted in her wake, longing for resolution. Such imagery reveals the ancient conviction that death without proper ritual created spiritual pollution. A soul cut short unnaturally could not simply slip silently into Hades. Instead, it lingered, its presence a reminder of unfinished business and violated cosmic order. Curses, too, intertwined closely with the restless dead. In tombs, wells, and even in the sea, archaeologists have found countless deficciones, thin lead tablets inscribed with binding spells, curses, or pleas for justice. Many were scratched with names meant to be punished, written backward or in strange characters to invoke secrecy and potency. The tablets were often pierced with nails to symbolize the binding of the victim's will. These curses were frequently addressed to souls of the violently dead, appealing to them as agents capable of carrying out vengeance from the underworld. The logic was chillingly simple. If a spirit had been wronged, it might be willing to wrong another in exchange. Even Pliny the Elder acknowledged that fear of such curses permeated Roman society, suggesting that nearly everyone dreaded the thought of being bound by malicious spells. It was not only the Greeks who viewed these spirits with reverence and fear. Early Roman religious festivals reveal a similar anxiety. During the Lemuria in May, Rome fell under an uneasy hush. Temples closed, marriages halted, and citizens stayed inside lest they cross paths with the restless dead. Families performed elaborate rites to expel wandering spirits from their homes. At midnight, the paterfamilias walked barefoot through the house, forming the protective sign with his fingers, keeping his gaze fixed forward. He filled his mouth with black beans, an offering the ghosts were believed to accept, and tossed others behind him, chanting, "With these beans I redeem me and mine." The beans were said to distract the spirits, who followed quietly, gathering them like food. Only after 9 repetitions would the father clang bronze vessels and loudly proclaim, "Depart, spirits of our ancestors." Only then was the household considered safe for another year. Throughout Greece, similar festivals existed under different names. During the Antisteria in Athens, the Care's vengeful spirits were believed to roam freely. Families sealed their homes with pitch, chewed protective whitethorn, and offered prayers to Hermes Psychopompos, the guide of souls. On the final day, they ordered the spirits to leave, reinforcing the fragile border between their world and the realm of the living. These rituals reflect a worldview steeped in the belief that the unquiet dead craved attention, sustenance, or appeasement. Neglect could lead to haunting, illness, or madness. Apuleius, though often inclined toward the fantastical, attempted a more systematic classification of spirits. According to him, the manes were benevolent ancestral ghosts, while the lemures were the dangerous dead, and the larvae were malevolent beings capable of causing madness or epilepsy. Yet even he admitted that the distinctions blurred in practice, for fear tended to merge categories together. The larvae, in particular, occupied a strange space between terror and mockery. They were sometimes treated as bogeymen, figures used to frighten children or produce grotesque humor in farces like the Atellinae. Actors dressed as skeletal larvae danced macabre routines, perhaps the ancient forerunners of medieval dances of death. Their imagery, half comical, half disturbing, suggests that the Romans coped with the fear of the dead partly through satire. But even in jest, the underlying dread persisted. Trimalchio, the boastful freedman of Petronius, famously had a silver skeleton brought to his dinner table, its rattling limbs reminding guests that life was fleeting and death inescapable. "Let us eat and drink," he declared, "for tomorrow we die." His spectacle was theatrical, yet it echoed a truth the Romans understood deeply. The dead were never far away. Another fascinating aspect of ancient belief is the conviction that the unquiet dead could continue to interact violently with the living. Stories abound of spirits tormenting the guilty, haunting murderers, or afflicting those who violated burial grounds. Executed criminals, denied proper rites, were especially feared. Their bodies often lay exposed as warnings, but their souls were thought to drift angrily across the earth. Such spirits were invoked in curses because they were believed to possess the power to harm with ferocity. The Romans, ever practical, attempted to contain these fears through law and ritual. Violating a tomb carried severe penalties, not only because it dishonored the deceased, but because it risked unleashing a restless spirit. Families invested heavily in monuments, inscriptions, and offerings to ensure their dead would not wander. Even the architectural placement of tombs lining roads outside the city was meant to keep spirits close enough to receive greetings and offerings, yet far enough to remain separate from daily life. The unease surrounding the restless dead reveals a profound truth about ancient cultures. Death was not a clean transition, but a vulnerable, ambiguous state. The soul's peace depended on how life ended, how the body was treated, and how survivors honored the memory of the departed. The Greeks and Romans feared not death itself, but the possibility that death might remain incomplete, that a spirit trapped between worlds might return with grief, anger, or longing powerful enough to disturb the living. And so, through rituals, stories, and solemn observances, they sought to mend the fragile rift between life and death, hoping to keep both realms in their rightful places. Among all the ghostly presences that haunted the ancient imagination, none were more feared than the unburied and the violently dead spirits trapped between worlds, unable to find rest because their final rites had been denied or their lives cut short by treachery. These beings did not linger peacefully at festival times, nor slip gently into dreams. They roamed through the night with fierce longing, clinging to the places where blood had been spilled or justice undone. And it was this very unrest that made them perfect instruments for the most chilling of ancient rituals, the cursed tablets known as deficciones, small sheets of lead inscribed with binding spells and entrusted to spirits hungry for retribution. Across the Greek and Roman world, These curses appear in tombs, wells, ruins, and even in the sea, hidden away like secret messages to the underworld. They were written in Greek, Latin, or strange symbols, often backward or in mirrored script, to intensify their potency. Many invoked the souls of the Biai-Othanatoi, the violently dead, believing that such spirits longed for any opportunity to strike at the living. The tablets were frequently pierced with nails, their inscriptions pressed with deliberate cruelty, as though the physical act of piercing might bind the victim more securely. The dead were addressed directly. As you have been robbed of life, so rob this person of his fortune, or torment him as you were tormented. It is disturbing to imagine how many people, ordinary citizens, wronged lovers, rival businessmen placed their faith in the rage of spirits, denied burial. The Greeks divided the restless dead into the oroi, the biathanatoi, and the ataphoi, and among these, the unburied, the ataphoi, were regarded with particular dread. Without burial, a soul hovered at the threshold of Hades, unable to cross the river Styx for 100 years. Aeneas, in his descent to the underworld, sees these souls stretching their hands toward the far shore in desperate longing. Patroclus appears to Achilles as one of these unburied spirits, begging for swift cremation so he may enter the realm of the dead. In this worldview, burial was not merely a ritual of respect. It was a spiritual necessity, the rite that restored cosmic balance. To leave a body unburied, even accidentally, was to imprison the soul in a state of restless misery. Because such souls wandered freely, they were believed to be especially active at night. Their hauntings were unpredictable, their motives unclear. They were not regulated by civic festivals nor soothed by family offerings. They appeared driven by forces the living could not comprehend. Sometimes they attacked those who had wronged them, but sometimes they lashed out indiscriminately, their torment spilling into the world like a poison. To counter these dangers, entire festivals arose, including the Roman Lemuria, a time when households performed midnight rites to drive out wandering spirits. Though many now treat these as quaint historical customs, the Romans practiced them with solemnity. No one wished to risk the displeasure of a ghost with nothing left to lose. The most dramatic evidence of the restless dead's power comes from the deficciones themselves. Some curses were petty, a lost lover wishing misery upon a rival, a gambler asking that his opponent's dice roll badly, or a merchant hoping for a competitor's ruin. But others carried a heavy moral weight. Many curses were found in wells where bodies had been dumped, or in graves of murder victims. The author of the curse sought justice from those who had been denied it in life, appealing to their shared experience of suffering. The spellcaster did not merely desire vengeance. They sought to weaponize the dead. One tablet found in Athens reads, "Bind down Themistocles, who stole my property. As you are cold and alone, make him cold and alone." Another, discovered near a tomb in Rome, adds a chilling plea, "I invoke you who died unjustly. Bring to ruin the one who ruined me." These inscriptions show how deeply ancient people believed that the dead still cared about justice, or perhaps that their own suffering made them more willing to inflict suffering in turn. It is difficult to read these words without sensing the raw human emotions behind them: grief, betrayal, jealousy, desperation, obsession given physical form through lead and iron. Yet not all spirits remained tools of vengeance. Some ancient authors tell of encounters with restless dead that resolved into peace rather than violence. One story concerns Chilos, the charioteer of Pelops, who died on the journey to Pisa and appeared to his master in a dream, begging for burial. Pelops honored him with a proper funeral, built a shrine, and named a place after him. In return, Chilos appeared again in a dream, thanking Pelops for the rites and offering guidance, which ultimately helped Pelops win the chariot race that secured his marriage to Hippodamia. The tale suggests that even the most troubled spirits could be pacified with compassion and ritual care. A similar theme appears in the famous story of Simonides, who discovered an unburied corpse on the shore and, moved by pity, gave the stranger a proper burial. Later, the man's ghost appeared in a dream, warning him not to board a particular ship. Simonides obeyed, and the ship sank soon afterward. Here, gratitude binds the dead to the living as surely as anger binds the vengeful. Kindness extends beyond mortality. Compassion becomes a form of spiritual protection. This motif developed into the widespread folklore cycle of the Grateful Dead, where a person helps bury an abandoned corpse and is rewarded by the deceased spirit in moments of danger. The Jewish versions of the story reflect this clearly. A young traveler pays off the debt of a man whose body hangs in chains as punishment for suspected theft. The ghost appears to him in various forms: a stone, an eagle, a man dressed in white guiding him safely home and promising blessings in the world to come. These stories show that even in tradition steeped in fear of restless spirits, the ancient imagination allowed space for redemption, reciprocity, and the idea that good deeds echoed beyond the grave. Still, such comforting narratives stand in stark contrast to tales of the violently dead whose revenge shook entire regions. In Sicily, one of Ulysses' crew ravished a maiden in the city of Tecmessa and was stoned to death by enraged townspeople. Ulysses sailed on without concern, but soon the ghost of the slain man began killing the inhabitants, sparing no age or gender. The fear became so great that the people abandoned their city until the oracle at Delphi advised them to appease the spirit by giving him a sacred enclosure and offering him the fairest maiden each year as his bride. Peace returned, but only through ritual appeasement, a chilling reminder of the price demanded by the unquiet dead. In the end, the restless spirits of the ancient world reveal more about the living than the dead. They reflect fears, injustices, guilt, desires for revenge, and hopes for deliverance. They are projections of unresolved emotions transformed into supernatural narratives, and the rites created to appease them: burial customs, festivals, curses, offerings demonstrate how urgently the ancients sought to maintain balance between the realms of life and death. To leave a soul wandering was to invite chaos. To honor it was to restore harmony. And through these haunting stories, we glimpse a world where the dead were never silent, and where the living listened with reverence, fear, and sometimes love. The belief that the dead could return to afflict, warn, or converse with the living was widespread in antiquity. But among all the supernatural beings the Greeks and Romans imagined, none were more dreaded than the lemures and larvae, the malevolent dead whose appearances carried threats rather than solace. Unlike ancestral spirits honored in festivals or the gentle shades who visited dreamers, these beings occupied a darker sphere, closer to demons than to departed human souls. Their presence was associated with madness, disease, and misfortune. and they were often invoked in curses or exorcised through elaborate rituals. Yet, even as writers and philosophers tried to analyze or dismiss them, ordinary people continued to believe that these spirits moved invisibly through their houses, fields, and streets, influencing daily life in ways that felt both intimate and terrifying. The Romans held annual festivals to pacify these dangerous spirits, most notably the Lemuria, when houses were purified at midnight and offerings were made to drive unwelcome ghosts away. Families lived in a hush during these nights, avoiding certain streets and abstaining from important activities. Ritual objects, black beans, bronze vessels, and incantations were employed not because they were symbolic, but because they were believed to have literal power. The paterfamilias would rise at night, walk barefoot with his hand forming the ancient apotropaic sign, and cast beans behind him without turning to look. He believed the lemures followed silently, gathering the beans, distracted by them and unable to harm the household. Only after repeating the ritual 9 times did he clang bronze pots to banish any spirit lingering in the shadows. It was a ritual steeped in fear, not reverence. The aim was not communion, but protection. The larvae, though sometimes distinguished from lemures, were often described with an even greater sense of dread. Apuleius depicted them as the souls of the wicked, restless, violent, and capable of causing madness or epilepsy. Their appearance in farces, where actors impersonated skeletons and demons, reveals how the Romans sometimes coped with fear through humor. Yet even in comedy, the larvae retained their threatening aura. They were grotesque reminders of mortality and moral disorder, embodiments of everything uncontrollable in human life. Trimalchio's famous dinner performance in Petronius's Satyricon, where a mechanical skeleton rattled its limbs on the table while he declared that death spares no one, reflects not only satire but a genuine cultural anxiety. The Romans lived with death close at hand through war, disease, and constant political upheaval, and the larvae expressed that fear in supernatural form. Despite this terror, the boundary between fear and fascination was often thin. Philosophers debated the nature of these spirits, some arguing that they were manifestations of air or dreams, others insisting they were real beings interacting with the human realm. Seneca wrote of invisible presences that caused madness or terror, hinting that the human mind might be more porous than it appeared. Plutarch considered whether the shadowy apparitions commonly reported in old houses were truly souls or merely impressions left behind by intense emotions, like the echo of a scream lingering in a canyon. Yet even these rational attempts to explain ghosts did not erase the deep cultural belief in malevolent spirits. Logic faltered in the face of collective experience. One of the most vivid accounts of such spirits comes from Pliny, who describes the haunting of a house in Athens by a ghost bound in chains. Though not explicitly called a larva, the spirit's behavior wandering with heavy iron shackles, rattling them through the night. Terrifying tenets aligns closely with Roman descriptions of restless, vengeful dead. Only when the bones were found and buried properly did the haunting cease, demonstrating the ancient conviction that even the most frightening ghosts could be appeased by fulfilling obligations the living had neglected. This theme, the need to honor the dead, runs through many ghost stories, suggesting that malevolence often arose from neglect rather than inherent evil. The Greeks, too, had their versions of such spirits. The Kyrs, spirits of violent death, were depicted as dark, winged beings who hovered over battlefields, thirsting for blood and preying upon dying soldiers. In myth, they were almost indistinguishable from personified doom. Though not described as ghosts in the modern sense, they represented the same terror, the idea that death could produce entities that continued to hunger after life, following battle and plague with horrifying persistence. Soldiers prayed to avoid the attention of the cares, hoping that if they must die, their souls would not be dragged into the ranks of these insatiable beings. Some accounts blend dread with tragic sympathy. Ovid tells of the ghost of a young woman who died before her wedding day and wandered the city at night, her bridal wreath still tangled in her hair. She was not dangerous, yet people feared to meet her, believing that premature death had made her spirit unstable. She embodied the category of the auroi, the untimely dead, whose sorrow, more than their malice, made them frightening. The ancients sensed that grief itself could fuel supernatural unrest. In places where violent death had occurred, people claimed the spirits never left. The plain of Marathon, the battlefield at Pharsalus, and the sites of Rome's many civil conflicts were all believed to harbor wandering souls. Travelers sometimes reported hearing cries, clashing weapons, or phantom footsteps following them through the night. These were not the heroic dead revered as protectors, but the restless multitude of unnamed souls who had perished without final rites. The landscape of the ancient world was thus imagined as layered with invisible presences, each tied to the place where life had been forcibly taken. The Romans, practical as they were, attempted to systematize these fears. Laws protecting tombs were severe, not only because tombs honored the dead, but because disturbing them might unleash spirits eager for revenge. Grave robbers risked more than legal punishment. They risked spiritual assault. In some inscriptions, the deceased themselves warn intruders, "Whoever harms this tomb, may he wander without peace, neither living nor dead." These curses reflect a worldview where the restless dead were active agents of justice, defending their final resting places with supernatural force. Yet scattered throughout these grim stories are glimpses of compassion. Rituals intended to pacify the malevolent dead also acknowledge their suffering. The offering of beans during Lemuria, the lighting of lamps at roadside shrines, and the care taken to bury unknown corpses all reveal a belief that even the most troubled spirits could be soothed. The frightening nature of these beings arose not from inherent evil, but from trauma unhealed, rites unmet, lives abruptly cut short. By honoring them, the living restored harmony. In the end, the lemures and larvae reflect a profound psychological truth about ancient society, that the living feared not simply death itself, but death out of order, death that broke the natural or moral laws. These spirits symbolize the chaos that resulted when life's essential rituals were denied. Their presence in stories and festivals reveals a culture striving desperately to impose structure on the uncontrollable, to negotiate peace with forces that embodied its deepest fears. And through these uneasy negotiations, the ancients expressed a truth that transcends time, that the dead, especially those wronged or forgotten, never fully disappear. They linger, demanding remembrance, justice, and the dignity that life failed to give them. The ancient world, for all its rational philosophers and civic order, carried an unshakable fear of those who had died by violence, souls torn abruptly from life, who lingered with the force of their shattered final moments still clinging to them. Among these restless spirits, None seized the ancient imagination more powerfully than the murdered dead. Their return always carried an aura of justice, an air of unfinished reckoning. Even centuries later, their stories preserved the belief that a murdered soul could not rest until acknowledged, avenged, or laid properly to peace. This conviction appears again and again in the literature of Greece and Rome, sometimes in tragic grandeur, sometimes in eerie domestic moments, and sometimes with a chilling intimacy that blurs the line between memory and haunting. In Euripides' Hecuba, one of the earliest and most somber depictions of such a ghost appears. The Trojan queen Hecuba dreams of her murdered son Polydorus, the youngest child of Priam, who had been entrusted to a supposed ally during the fall of Troy. The dream does not come as a soft visitation, but as a blunt, painful revelation. Her son's spirit stands before her, soaked in blood, calling upon her to discover his body and avenge him. When the body is found washed ashore, pierced with blades from the betrayal that killed him, the prophecy of the dream proves true. It is this ghostly warning that unleashes Hecuba's terrible vengeance. Euripides presents the apparition not merely as a haunting, but as a cry for justice from a soul violently thrust out of life. The mother's grief becomes the conduit through which justice emerges, a theme the ancients embraced with deep emotional force. The murder victim, who returns to accuse the living, appears even more starkly in the story of Pausanias, regent of Sparta. As told by Herodotus, Pausanias sought to seize power through treachery and secret alliances. When he attracted suspicion, he took refuge in a temple, where, by sacred law, he could not be killed. But as starvation forced him toward death, a messenger overheard him confessing his crimes, among them the murder of a young girl whose parents had entrusted her to him as part of a hostage exchange. The ghost of this girl, Herodotus tells us, appeared to the Ephor Sparta's judges, declaring that Pausanias must pay the penalty for her death. Whether literal or symbolic, the apparition had undeniable impact. The Ephors bricked up the temple entrance, forcing Pausanias to die inside. Even after his death, the Spartans worried they had polluted the sacred space by killing someone within its walls. So they attempted posthumous rites, moving his corpse and offering sacrifices to the outraged spirit. Such stories reveal the deep anxiety the Greeks had about the wrath of murdered souls. When justice was denied in life, they believed it would rise from death. More personal and intimate is the tale of the soldier visiting his mother as a ghost. Preserved in Valerius Maximus, the soldier had fallen in battle far from home, his body left unburied. His mother, unaware of his fate, prayed nightly for his safe return. One evening, as she slept, he appeared beside her, wearing blood-stained armor and carrying the dust of the battlefield. He told her he had been slain and begged her to arrange his burial. The next day, travelers arrived at the house bearing news of the battle and confirming the time and manner of his death. The mother's grief was transformed into action. She gathered the remains, performed the rites, and laid him to rest. The vision carried with it no vengeance, only longing, the desire of the unburied dead to rest in peace. Even in this gentler form, the lesson remained clear. Burial was not just a duty, but a spiritual necessity. Stories in which the murdered dead return to accuse their killers often blend the supernatural with the psychological. One such tale, recounted by Plutarch, concerns the traitor Sulla, who executed a young man despite having promised him safety. Soon after, Sulla began to suffer horrible nightmares in which the dead youth appeared, his face pale, but his eyes fiercely alive, repeating the accusation that Sulla had broken faith and murdered him unjustly. The nightmares grew so intense that Sulla became physically ill, and his decline was attributed to the wrath of the murdered soul. Whether this was the product of guilt or supernatural fear mattered little in ancient logic. Both were intertwined. A crime of such magnitude, they believed, inevitably seeped into the spiritual realm. Seneca tells a similar story of a noblewoman haunted by the ghost of the slave she had beaten to death in a fit of rage. The apparition stood silently at her bedside, night after night, not threatening her with words but with the imprint of his suffering written across his face. Madness soon followed. Such stories reinforced the moral teaching that violence, especially committed in cruelty or betrayal, created spiritual disturbances that no earthly defense could undo. Even outside literature, real inscriptions and archaeological findings confirm how deeply the fear of the murdered dead permeated daily life. Many curse tablets refer specifically to victims of murder, calling upon them to enact vengeance. As you were wronged, wrong him, reads one tablet. As your blood was shed without justice, bring injustice upon my enemy. The belief that murdered souls possessed special powers arose from the idea that they burned with unresolved emotion, anger, despair, betrayal passions that could spill into the world of the living. Mythic tradition amplified this idea through stories like that of Myrtilus, the charioteer betrayed by Pelops. As Myrtilus lay dying, cast into the sea by the very man he had helped, he cursed Pelops and his descendants. And indeed, the house of Atreus, descended from Pelops, became infamous for generations of bloodshed, revenge, and madness. Agamemnon's murder, Clytemnestra's vengeance, Orestes' matricide. To the ancient mind, these tragedies were not random. They were the echo of Myrtilus's dying curse, the voice of a murdered man reverberating through time. Another haunting tale concerns the spirit of a murdered guest, whose host had slain him secretly for his valuables. The ghost appeared repeatedly in the host's dreams, patient at first, then increasingly insistent, urging him to confess. When he continued to ignore the visions, the ghost took physical form, standing at the foot of the host's bed. Terrified, the murderer fled into the night, screaming of a phantom chasing him. He eventually confessed his crime publicly, begging for any punishment that might end the torment. For the ancients, this story illustrated a universal truth. The murdered dead did not forget, and they did not forgive. What is most striking across all these stories is not merely the horror but the sense of moral consequence. The spirits of the murdered were terrifying not because they were evil, but because they were wronged. Their return was an indictment of human betrayal. Their hauntings were the echoes of crimes that demanded redress. Through these tales, the ancients expressed their deepest moral anxieties, the fear that injustice could disturb the very fabric of the world, and that the dead would rise to restore the balance the living had violated. In exploring these Greek and Roman ghost stories, we discover far more than eerie encounters or supernatural curiosities. We uncover the emotional landscape of the ancient world, its fears, its hopes, and its relentless quest to understand what lies beyond the final breath. For the Greeks and Romans, ghosts were not merely shadows that drifted through ruined houses or echoed across haunted battlefields. They were mirrors reflecting the moral fabric of human life. Every apparition carried meaning, The unburied spirit cried out for justice. The dream visitor returned with love or warning. The summoned dead revealed truths too heavy for the living, and the restless victims of violence demanded the one thing denied to them in life: recognition. These stories endure because they speak to questions we still ask today. What remains of us after death? Do love, guilt, or injustice echo in ways we cannot see? And why does memory refuse to fade, even when the world insists on moving forward? In these ancient tales, the boundary between the living and the dead is thin, not frightening merely because of ghosts, but because of what they reveal about us. If you've been captivated by this journey into the ancient supernatural, into the myths and anxieties that shaped entire civilizations, then I invite you to stay with us. Havelin Storytime is where forgotten stories breathe again, where history becomes vivid, and where the past still has something urgent to say. Subscribe, join our community, and let's continue exploring the world's most powerful stories together.